what we have available today during this session is an office hour style session. Happy to take questions really about anything. If you have questions about running Node, related to testnet, just related to the development of the project and things that are happening in that space. I'm happy to talk about any of those things. We don't have anything new to test today, specifically related to Node. There are some things coming in that I am keen to test as soon as those PRs get merged, and they include the following. One is Sebastian's work to improve the peering protocol in Kademlia, to add shuffle to it so that hopefully we can see improved peering. I know that we've observed in this testing before, and I think I'm recalling correctly, I think it's been Phil sometimes that for sure has observed challenges with finding a high number of peers. And so we would like to observe that change, and hopefully with the shuffle that we might see that. So that's one thing that I'd like to look at in the near term as soon as that PR is merged. The other thing that I'm curious to see, we are working on updating the proof of stake contract related to the use of the wallet components and cost accounting. That PR should be merged hopefully very soon before the end of this week, and also eager to look at that and how that especially impacts transactions across the network, making sure that that does all the things that we want it to do. And then very importantly, looking forward to testing with the renovation of RSpace. And so there is the PR that I'm waiting for right now is the one that will introduce the flag where we can use the new RSpace. The two RSpaces will run in parallel, and so you'll use the flag to call the renovated one. I'm looking for that PR to get merged. We'd like to take it for a little drive in our dev network before we upgrade the public test net. But that's something that I'm also very keen to work with, and maybe we'll be in a place to do that by this time next week. So that's kind of where we are from a development standpoint, and the reasons why we don't have anything specifically new for you to test today. And I certainly appreciate you being here and all the testing support that you've provided in the past. So, and also mindful and respectful of your time. So if there are any questions that you have or anything that you would like to discuss in this forum, happy to talk about that. As a reminder, this is a recorded session. And otherwise, that's kind of our agenda for today.
Okay, question. There's still a problem when you try to pull the VDAG from the node, it's kind of stuck. Will this be resolved with the RSpace renovation?
That's a good question. Let me make sure that I think I know the experience you're talking about, but let me make sure that we're having the same experience. So you're calling VDAG either from your own node or from one of the validators, and from your perspective, it appears to hang. Is that correct?
I haven't tried to pull from my node, read-only node, but I tried to pull from node 7, and it turned into high disk throughput when I watched on the collect.d RGNDF link.
Okay.
For a quite long time, there is no return.
Yeah, so I don't know how that might relate to the RSpace renovation. It might, and I also know that we do have a ticket open for that because I'm observing the same. Just in short, being unable to pull VDAG from a validator, and it's unclear to me as to why, and we haven't picked the investigation of that up yet.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Phil, I'm looking at your question. Changes to the Genesis ceremony planned or have been done compared to the Genesis ceremony we did back in Berlin at Archon. In general, the ceremony is the same. And what I mean by that is we have a master of ceremony nodes, just like we did at Archon 3, that generates, that starts off the ceremony. And all of the validators also generate that everybody generates their version of the Genesis block using the parameters agreed upon. And then similar to what we did in Archon 3, that the ceremony master will send out that unapproved block. Validators will receive what's called in the code base the expected candidate, and then their nodes will confirm that it matches the Genesis block that they created. And when they have a match, that's indicated that they've approved, and they send back the approval to the Master of Ceremony node. The Master of Ceremony node has some parameters for how many approvals it needs before launching the network, as well as a time parameter for how much time, the minimum amount of time that must elapse before the launch of a network, given the specified number of approvals. And then once all those criteria are met, the Master of Ceremonies node will convert and start sending out the approved block, just as we observe it in testnet, so that not only the validators would receive the approved block, but anybody on the network at that point would have the opportunity to receive the approved block. We are, so that's, there's almost no change in that to what we did in Archon 3. We are having an issue with that, however. The Genesis ceremony, as I just described, is written into an integration test, and it is a requirement of all commits to the code base to pass the Genesis ceremony integration test before being merged into the code base, and that is working. We see code passing that test. We see the Genesis ceremony in integration tests working quite well. And very recently, we attempted a Genesis ceremony with the goal of demonstrating it with the inclusion of the rock balances, and are not seeing that working, and are investigating a bug related to that. And at the step that it's failing is where the Master of Ceremonies node does generate, meets all the criteria for approving the block, has the approved block, and starts sending it out. And for reasons that we don't understand yet, the validators are not receiving that approved block. They either not getting to them, or something's happening along that way. And so Pavel is working on the investigation of that at this time. But we need to resolve that, because we need to not only be able to do this in the wild, but we need to be able to do it many times before we actually get to the mainnet launch. Why do we go with the centralized master node? Well, it has to start somewhere. I mean, at some point, some node has to start the ceremony, right? I don't remember what your proposals were.
Well, it's not like the master node is the sole trusted party. You have validators that validate this block, and it has to be same on all initially wanted validators to get approved.
Yeah, I think from the design of the ceremony is intended to be to fulfill the requirement that the launch of the RChain mainnet has to be a community-driven, community-verified launch, and that's how it came to be that you have a variety of validators, and you have the expectations for what they need to do, and what they have to send back and agree on in order to launch the network.
Hey there, can you hear me?
Hey, yes, hi.
All right, perfect.
Unmute Phil.
Yeah, I moved over to a room where I can speak normally in a open space office. So.
I see.
But there was a free meeting room, so. I'm just asking because back a few months back, I did some proposals right after RCon 3 where I proposed that we actually don't need this one master node handling all these kind of this whole Genesis ceremony, but we rather could stick with a peer-to-peer process that is very similar to how the Ethereum network launched back in the day. And actually it works like this. You have this pre-generated Genesis block out of this snapshot or whatsoever. So it's just like a script which runs, which queries an Ethereum node, for example, for the snapshot, takes all these balances into account and pre-generates the Genesis block. But there is just one piece of information missing, and that piece of information, for example, is the hash of a specific Ethereum block that's in the future. So no one knows that piece of information. And then the piece of information arrives, and everyone can generate this Genesis block. And since around maybe those approvals to the other peers, and once enough, and the point is everyone sends around their approvals, which was basically just signed messages, in the peer-to-peer network. And everyone aggregates those signed messages, and once anyone reaches the quorum, the network is basically live, and anyone can build on top of the block, and adds the basically the attestations to the Genesis block in a transaction or whatsoever within the next block.
Interesting. Can I ask a couple clarifying questions?
Sure.
So the one of the things is where do they get that the specification for the exact block height? I think I heard you say everybody's missing it until some point where everybody gets it. Where do they get it from?
So at least there needs to be some kind of process which is not on the blockchain, just a social process where there's consensus on what this specific Ethereum block height should be, where this missing piece of information is taken from. But it's just like for taking, we have this very similar process for taking the snapshot where this will be a specific block and everyone agrees that this will be snapshot for the balances. And in the same way, we agree upon a specific Ethereum block where we take the hash as the missing piece of information so that no one knows in advance what this Genesis block will look like, so no one can start building a private R chain on its own and then release it to the public later on.
Right.
And this is also quite handy in that you don't have this central piece of master node which needs to handle all this traffic. We don't know basically how many validators will be there. In this master node is also might be an attack vector. It might be DOSed, might get DOSed during the process. So going with the peer-to-peer network for this process seems pretty canonical, I suppose.
Interesting.
And I've spoken with Michael Burge about this process back at RCon 3, and I'm pretty sure we put that into the wiki as proposals. But I might look it up.
Okay, I'll poke around too. Thank you for bringing that back up. I didn't remember that. September. Any other thoughts on that? Oh yeah, I do see it, Phil. I found it. I'll put the link here in the chat. It's under the section starting with protocol for validators approving a block, and you have your proposal is there.
This process is also quite nice in the way that it reduces the liability of the co-op for the launch of the main app, because it's totally a peer-to-peer process. No one is in charge, and yeah, basically it's just the community that starts the node, and it's the social consensus that this is the missing piece of information out of basically the Ethereum network.
Your thoughts about the protocol change if mainnet were to be launched with just co-op validators?
Pardon, once again, what do you mean?
If do your thoughts about the protocol change if there were a situation where the mainnet were to be launched with just our chain validators, nodes owned and operated by the co-op?
I mean, the question would be whether it's just like that it happens to be that most of the nodes or all the nodes are from are run or are managed and operated by the co-op, or that anyone could operate a validator node, but it just happens to be that it is the co-op that runs all the nodes. I mean, that's a crucial distinction there,
Yeah.
I suppose, because in the one case it's just it is basically a permission chain, and we actually don't need this ceremony that is trying to be community driven. Or on the other hand, it's just everyone could be a validator. That just happens to be that just the cooperative. I have a similar question that is for how deployments are done. So currently it is that we still deploy to a validator node, and I made the proposal back in the day to actually propagate the deploy in the peer-to-peer network, so that anyone can pick up a deploy as a validator. What's the current status at that end?
Good question. I need to refresh my memory, and maybe you can refresh your memory along with me. I'm putting a link here in the chat. This is the document. I know you've looked at it deeply, the validator incentives and Casper document. And this is, you know, just for everyone's awareness, what Phil's describing, this idea of deploying, you know, to the peer-to-peer network and then having, and not having to specify which validator you're deploying to. That conversation happened in the space related to this document. I'm looking at the document now to make sure I understand where we landed. And I think we did land, I'm looking at the paragraph that starts, transactions are signed to a particular validator. And also looking at your comment, Phil, of disagreement, why this is not an ideal way to go forward.
We had a subsequent conversation where we nixed that idea, and the deploys are going to get gossiped to all validators.
Okay.
But I don't know that it ever got captured in that doc.
Okay, I need to check in on that. So your recollection, Chris, is we ended with gossip.
Yes.
Okay.
Just to be clear, these are the Genesis ceremony and the general deployment to a specific node are related but separate topics.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
So the question about whether one should deploy to a specific validator came also up during the discussions of all these Casper economic proposals, whereas there was the point that you might have lazy validators and there must be an incentive for someone to gain transaction fees and whatsoever. So whether you should deploy to a validator or not, or it should propagate and gossip it in the network, also depends on the economic model. But I just wanted to ask what the current decision or what the current design is for the system to be.
I'm poking around in Jira to see how we've got this ticketed. I do see there is a RChain 1922, 27 that came from you, Phil, with that exact suggestion of gossip. It's 1972.
This is a good topic for next week, Kelly, to just refresh over all of the validator incentives and output it out as we can clean up the doc that's capturing the design.
Yep.
So I think it's out of date now with regards to conversations.
Yeah, agreed.
And I'd have to ping Kent to know, to get the specifics on some of those, because I don't remember either.
Thank you, Phil.
Speaking about validator incentives, what is the current stand on validator strategies when it comes to, for example, block proposal strategy?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
So, what is the current mechanism that creates a live chain? So, what keeps a validator creating a block? is there a mechanism by which a validator is chosen to create a block? Is it an economic model where there is a specific incentive to create a block? And what is the validator strategy for that?
I'm
I'm
pausing.
pausing because I'm trying to think of my last conversation with Kent. I don't know the answer to that, Phil, because my last conversation with Kent, I don't know if I'm misrecollecting this, was that we were going back to not an economic incentive to just generate blocks whenever you want, but a time-based or a round-robin-based approach. But I don't remember, honestly. I got to ask Kent, because we went back and forth on that one, and I think we landed back on the very first proposal we started with, but I have to check in with him.
Was there any kind of decision made on how the validator rotation should look like, whether, how the bonding process should look like, or whether there is a validator rotation at all, or what? Yeah, I mean, should be.
I think we should. My suggestion, because you're gonna keep asking a bunch of questions and get not very good answers. I think we should have an overview session of all of this next Thursday, after we get a chance to sync with Kent, and that way we can just update the doc first of all, so you can find it in written form, but also we can go over it on this session if we want to. By the way, it's not gonna.
Yeah.
I don't think it's gonna be very productive for us to speculate at this point, because I've honestly, it's been probably 4 or 5 weeks since I've even talked to Ken about this side of the dev work.
Yeah, I agree. By any chance, do you know what the current snapshots, doing the snapshot, how the process looks like?
That we do know about. Tomasz, do you want to can you talk a little bit about how we're looking at the snapshot right now?
You mean the? Could you please repeat the question?
Yeah, no worries. How we do have a process, and have been doing some work to pull from Ethereum the rock balances. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we're doing that and how others can do that as well.
Yeah, so there's this rock balance reporter project on GitHub, and it's a little bit, it's a little rewrite of the old one that DC made. And basically, you can just download it and follow the README to run it. You just need some Ethereum nodes to. Yeah, you need the API and the Web3 API, and and that's it. You need access to some Ethereum node. We have our own node, and in future I would like to upgrade this source balance reporter to actually periodically collect new balances so that you can look at snapshot at any block height. But so far it needs to be done manually, and this Ethereum node is not closed open to public. It's just for us. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that. So that's, from a technical standpoint, that's what we're doing. I think, Phil, you also might be asking in terms of how to determine the height. Is that correct?
Yeah, also the process around choosing the block, publishing and announcing the block.
Yeah. Well, it's not recorded in the wallet file. I've just set it to some block arbitrarily selected. So your question is how should we select the block? Because as far as I know, at some point in future, before the mainnet launch, we will decide that, okay, this block, everything freeze. But right now, it doesn't really matter. It just needs to be some latest block, I guess.
Yeah, so Phil and others, I kind of have to talk about this on two planes. One is while the dev team was still under PyroFX, and to talk a little bit about that plan. And then I will also say that we haven't revisited this plan since then. So I'm going to describe what we had thought about and clarify that we haven't revisited it to confirm that this is still the plan, but under the guidance and advice of Mike Stay and Nash Foster, this is what we had intended to do was in a period leading up to the launch of Mercury, of the RChain mainnet. And we at that time talked about it in terms of a 3-month period to align with the hardening phase of the platform, so that at that 3-month mark prior to the launch of mainnet, we would do the following. We would create a timer, and that would project a range of block heights on the Ethereum network, of which the snapshot would be taken, and that over time that timer would narrow the range, and then at some point aligning to a decision that the platform was ready, we would if I recall correctly, and I want to make sure I'm very clear here, what I'm doing is drawing from recollection and not from documentation. If I recall correctly, we would freeze and announce the block height, a very narrow window of block height, because my understanding is we didn't want to announce the exact block height too soon, at the risk of scamming and just a security risk, but that we would get a very narrow window and encourage and share that with community members and with exchanges to kind of specify this is it, we're locking in, and then move forward with the launch in terms of having at some point, I think we said maybe 24 to 72 hours before we would announce a height, and that would be the snapshot height. We had intended at that time on the developer website to publish that timer, so that it would be very clear to everyone what range we were looking at, and as we narrowed that down towards the mainnet launch, and had scripting in place to govern that timer so that people could see. But again, that was the plan. The last time I talked about that was in just before RCon 3 with Mike and Nash, and we have not revisited that as a team or with the cooperative since that point. So that's definitely work that needs to be done. Any other thoughts or questions? This is actually, I'm very grateful, Phil, for you bringing this up. It's helpful to kind of put our heads back in this space because it has been a while and we have been also very much in the weeds doing other things on the platform. So I do appreciate you bringing these up. Any other questions about really anything?
Yes, so quite a while ago, I experienced this bug where if you propose a bunch of blocks, the time that it needs to get propagated and deployed and proposed, it's proposed in time, increased consecutively. So with every block that is in the DAG, it took longer to propose a block. Is that behavior still in there, or did you find the bug that caused this behavior?
So I missed the first part of that description. Can you repeat it? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, sure, no worries. So I guess it was in late October. I ran a few tests and I experienced this weird behavior where with an increasing DAG, so with an increasing number of blocks added to the DAG, the proposed time increased also. So
Yes.
Yeah. And so, yeah, Phil, the work that you did at that time along with Joshi was really helpful because as we also continue to observe that, especially as we started to want to have blockchains, longer blockchains in testnet, that was the impetus for the renovation of our space. Because it was not sustainable. What you observed in terms of it takes longer and longer the longer the chain gets to handle proposes in particular was not sustainable. So the work that Dom and Wukash have done to renovate our space is very much intended to address that, and that's something that I think we're maybe 2 PRs away from having that flag in place where we can start playing with that to observe that that really addresses the issue. I can't speak very deeply to what it is they did to resolve that, but suffice to say that what you observed and what they attempted to address in that renovation is exactly aligned.
That sounds very good.
I think there's one other component to this answer, though, that's not related to the efficiency of the actual RSpace code, which is how deep, how far back the deploys have to go to confirm that they're not a redeployment of something that's been deployed. This is, I don't know, Phil, if you remember the conversation around, this was one of the validator incentive threads that we were pulling on back when we had the discussion about introducing, a mechanism to make sure that we could throw out deploys that are too old. Is this ringing a bell?
Not really. I mean, can you elaborate on the point? Maybe I can remember.
This is just in like 2 months ago validator conversation we had. There was a discussion around right now there's a timestamp component in the deploy, and it serves, part of it, what it does is serve to ensure uniqueness of that particular seed of randomness for that deploy, because the unforgeable names all derive from that. And so the question was, we need to prevent replays. We need to look back and make sure it's not been used before. So I believe part of the, and I don't know if that was part of the slowdown that you guys experienced in October, but that the problem with that approach originally was, if I'm not mistaken, it had to walk all the way back to make sure that that deploy had not been done before to prevent replay. So I had to look at every single previous, and that's changed. So it's, and I believe now it's more windowed, so that we only have to look back just a little bit to make sure it's not been to make sure it's not a replay. I don't know. Again, I don't know how much that particular issue was involved in the slowdown that you were seeing, if it was all just RSpace related, but I did want to at least bring that up, because that was another concern about deploys taking forever as the DAG grew.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah. I mean, with the DAG, a nonce model is not that easy, but would be possible, I suppose, as well. So some sort of combination of nonce with another piece of information about the DAG. But yeah,
I think that's what the
I
think that's what the Casper Labs are doing.
yeah, that might be. Yeah, but I know what you mean. Obviously, if you have to go back and see if the specific deploy isn't in the existing DAG, then you have to go through the whole DAG, and this increases linearly in time. I mean,
Right.
yeah.
Kelly, can you just for precision, when you say that's what Casper Lab, what exactly did you think Casper Lab was doing?
I think I recall from either reading something or a conversation that they are using a nonce to address the issue of how far back do you go. Does that make sense?
So your statement makes sense, but the actual implementation doesn't. Like, I don't see how that helps. If it's a nonce, unless it's, well, yeah. I guess it depends on what kind of nonce we're talking about.
Yeah, and that I don't know.
So if it's a truly a nonce where it's just some random number, then that doesn't help. If it's one where it's incrementing counter, then I suppose that would probably work.
Guys, I have one topic to talk about when the current discussion is like.
I'm fine to move on.
Okay. Maybe you've seen a discussion in testnet channel. I've asked for hardware specifications of current testnet nodes because I can share my screen right now. Can you see it?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I deployed I deployed a lot of transactions onto nodes. I run my script, and I can see from the logs of node 7 this picture. So actually, deploy should contain this log message that I'm starting transaction from to ref, from this wallet to this wallet, and after successful completion, it should print like finished transaction. And it seems like Node constantly trying to execute transactions, and I don't see the I don't see signs of transaction completion. And this turns me into the question which I already have asked: what's the current bottleneck of the hardware from the hardware perspective? Is it doesn't seem that is CPU, because CPU consumption is pretty low. RAM being eaten pretty much quickly. But I've asked about is our space need a really high throughput storage, really high I/O storage. So if you can see, can send some stats, and I found that reads and writes are not symmetric. So I just wonder if node receive block, should that block write to our space some changes or not? Because reads are about 40 times bigger than writes to our space. So my question is, could be that current disk is the bottleneck of the node performance? And what is the current speed of the persistent disk, Google persistent disk? What's the current plan being used?
Yeah, so on Google we use SSDs, but it should have throughput. I think some megabytes per second. It's reasonable.
Are there like I found I posted a screenshot. There are some SSD disks with like 30 IOPS per gigabyte, and another plan with like 6 times bigger, and another one with 8 times bigger.
Yeah, these are local SSDs. The problem with this is that when your virtual machines migrate, the data on the disk are not kept. So, yeah, I actually haven't yet got to investigating this. Currently, there's a problem with growing memory, which isn't in Java, but in LMDB, and that's what I'm currently focused on. And I have to admit that I'm not really sure what the performance bottleneck is.
Okay, thanks. Because it looks like there is some bottleneck.
Sure.
But it's not clear what is this. And the disk subsystem is the most maybe obvious one for me. I don't know, because I know much about drive space.
Yeah, sure. The LMDB is memory mapped, and the kernel every now and then has to write the pages back.
Yeah. I've did a quick research, and I found that LMDB is pretty good at reads and not so good at writes. So if you haven't seen, I've posted in the dev channel some work of one project that tried to extend LNDB to handle high write throughput.
I see. libmd debics. Thanks.
Yeah. I hope this will be helpful. And Kelly, actually, as I remember, there is some work on the eliminating invariant replay deploys, right? So it should drastically reduce the resource consumption when it's implemented, because deploys don't go in the circle or the network.
Yes, and in fact, so that PR is in. Just make sure that that's the right one. I just got an update on that ticket today. Yeah, so I'm looking to make sure that it's the PR that went in is a fix or yeah, he's calling it a fix. So let me put a link here. So this merged, PR 2377 merged yesterday and is intended to be the resolution of our chain 3244, which is in fixing the repeat deploy that we were observing. There's the ticket for that. So we will play with that in DevNet, and we'll include that in the next update of testnet.
That's cool.
Yeah, that would be cool. We have about 5 more minutes left. Are there any other questions, thoughts you want to share? I just want to call out, I'm grateful for this conversation today. You've given us some good questions and certainly some food for thought to help us continue to be forward thinking as we move towards mainnet and the launch of mainnet. And as always, your use of the platform is critical and super helpful in revealing issues that we can then go back and work on. So thank you for that. I will also add, so we as a development team are getting ready to meet together in Poland starting on Monday. And so we will be very focused on having a lot of conversation, and I don't expect many changes to go into the code base between now and our time together here next week. Although I do think, as we discussed earlier, it would be good for us maybe to use time here next week to walk through the validation protocol and economics as we understand it and are planning to implement it to be complete for Mercury. So I think we'll talk with Kent about that, but I think that might be a good use of the time here.
Sounds good. Two more questions. One is about the hardware requirements for running a validator node. Are there any kind of updates after running those test nets and or larger test nets?
Yeah, and I think, Tomasz, correct me if I'm wrong, are the specifications for the nodes we're using in the wiki, are they available?
Yes, they should be public. Let me check. I will make them public if they are not.
So Phil, we can certainly share what's running in testnet, and I don't know. Well, here's what I do know. There were specifications shared a while ago related to the validator sale of what Pyrofex intended to their specifications for validating nodes. I believe they're different from what we're using in testnet right now, because obviously we don't need that heft. And there's not been an update or guidance given to validators for exactly what would be recommended. So in short, I can share with you what we're using in testnet. I can refer you to what Pyrofex suggested related to documents that went out with the validator sale, and confirm that we haven't provided any updates at this point.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, just wanted to make sure. Maybe you've observed something that there's at least X gigabyte of RAM needed in order to keep the node running or whatsoever. We haven't had yet that many big networks.
That's right. That's right.
One last point I fear on my notes regarding synchronization. I got the impression over the last sessions that the whole synchronization strategy isn't optimized yet, or at least that there is space to improve. What are there any current proposals for improvement?
Let me make sure I understand the question correctly. The synchronization strategy, meaning you start up a node and you want to sync to the network?
Exactly. So my observation was that you ask the peers for a specific range of blocks or whatsoever, or for all missing blocks, and you ask all your peers more or less ask for the same block, and then what you get is you get a bunch of multiple blocks, and some blocks are missing, and then you end up in the situation that you have half the deck, but you can't process the blocks because, or at least you can't process up to the current point because some blocks in between are missing. So.
Right. So you describe it very accurately. There's no change to the protocol right now. That's exactly what's happening. Something that is proposed is a more frequent gossip of the fork choice tip beyond just the report, the ask and receive at node startup. But I'm not aware of, and I don't see any work planned for making any changes to that to the sync protocol at this point.
I see. Yeah, I mean, it felt like that it is certainly not optimized, because last time I was trying to synchronize to a block height of, I don't know, 150, and it took me more than 40 minutes to do so, if I can remember correctly, or 30 minutes. And it were not blocks that were actually huge, or I don't know. I mean, there wasn't much to process at all.
Mm-hmm.
It felt like that in an Ethereum blockchain, that would have been a matter of not even seconds, but rather milliseconds to get the blocks and to process them. And
okay, let me make sure I understand that. So in a matter of seconds, you can stand up a node on Ethereum and have the full state of their blockchain?
I mean, if the full state of the blockchain just contains 150 blocks, that is a matter of seconds.
Okay. Okay, that's good to know.
I mean, with the R space, I know there's a certain overhead, but it shouldn't be that the overhead is that large that if you have 150 blocks, that it is a matter of 20 minutes, 30 minutes to catch up.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, in the same time, even the same amount of blocks can be added to the block height. So we really need to make sure that every node is able to catch up at some point. If the number of blocks added to the DAG is higher than the number of blocks I can catch up, well then it's impossible for a node to ever get to the tip of the node.
Yep, and that's we have certainly discussed that. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, it's good, I think, that those questions came up before the retreat. So you have some time to go over it.
Thank you, Phil. Make my to-do list longer.
You're welcome.
No, in all sincerity, and especially because we're recording, I really do. This is important and it's helpful, and I really am grateful for it. Thank you. All right, we are at the top of the hour, and so we're going to wrap up here. Our current thought and the plan for next week, since we are unlikely to have a new release ready to play with on testnet, is related to our work on the dev retreat, is to pull Kent in and have a deeper conversation about the validation protocol and what is planned, and some time for Q&A related to that. So that's our tentative plan, and as always with our chain, subject to change. But thanks again for being here today, and we look forward to talking with you at this time next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.